Hello! Hi, how's it going? All right, it is time for the sixth chapter in the Teach Us Dr. Hirsch learning series. The only, and hopefully only, lecture series taught to you by a virtual tuber on the internet who also has a doctorate in psychology. So this is actually like a completely authentic and good and like honestly very useful intro to psychology course. Also the first one I'm doing from my new place because I've been moving lately, hence why there's been a little bit of a gap in uploads here. So let's get started. What are we gonna learn about learning? It's an interesting topic. It's one that I always go back and forth about moving earlier into the course, but it's also one that I think you can get through. Like you can, I think where it sits is the earliest I could really go over it because you have to talk about like brains and neurons and stuff for things to make sense, and that means you got to do biological psychology, and then you got to do neuroanatomy, and you got to talk about neurotransmitters and stuff. But like we're good. At this point in the course, we have the foundation down. And so everything from here is going to be sort of a smorgasbord, as it would be, of different courses and subjects and bits and pieces, because now we have the foundation to understand them and to make connections between them as well. So let's get into learning. What are we going to look at here? So I always like starting off with a little bit of a summary, just kind of a roadmap, as it were, to really kick into what we can expect. We're going to mostly be covering conditioning in this section. We're going to be talking about classical conditioning. We're going to be talking about operant conditioning. We're going to be talking about cognitive models of learning. We're going to talk about biological influences on learning, stuff like giftedness and talent, whether or not those things are actually real. We'll also be talking about animal models, talking about a couple of different things in terms of like instincts. What are they? How real are they? And how do they impact trainability? We'll also talk about fads in learning, like sleep education tapes or watching VTubers on the internet to learn things. So whether or not those work, we will find out. For my sake, I hope that at least one of those does. All right. So. You also might notice, if you're familiar with the not the Teach Us Dr. Hirsch series, but the How to Do Nothing reading series, we are going to have a repeat guest in B.F. Skinner, who also wrote Walden 2, which was a pretty major feature of, I want to say, part 3 or part 4 of that series. So he's going to show up again. And it's going to be hopefully a more fun point this time because it's less dystopian. Because it turns out that Skinner was a very good psychologist, a very dystopian writer. All right, let's get into learning. So what do we mean when we talk about learning? Let's actually define the thing that we're going to talk about. So what is learning? Learning is a change in behavior or thought following an experience. So a change in the frequency of behaviors or thoughts following some kind of experience is basically the sum of all learning. Do you, after being praised, do you improve your study habits? Do you change your behavior? After someone tells you to stop being sad, do you change maybe self-depreciating thoughts? Odds are probably not, that we would not say that's a good conduit for learning. We can talk about that more later. But really, that's what we're talking about here. How do you change behavior? How do you change thoughts over time? And what events can happen in our lives that cause us to learn or to change our behaviors naturally? So here's 2 simple examples. The first is habituation. Now, have you ever noticed, like, if they've ever been in, like, let's say you have like noisy neighbors. You're living in an apartment, you've got a noisy next door neighbor, and around the same time every day, they decide they're going to do ring fit. And they are stomping and they are jumping and they are making all the noise, and they're right above your head. But you notice after about 20 or 30 minutes of them doing it, you kind of just don't pay attention anymore. That is an example of learning. You are habituating to that stimulus, that noise in your environment, and so you are responding less strongly over time. You just kind of you don't care anymore. Or, the first time somebody, oh God, let's say you're a kid on the playground and someone fakes that they're gonna punch you, and you flinch and you move away, and they're like 2 for flinching, and you're like, oh no, what a crooked and cruel world that we live in. But then the second time they do it, you don't flinch. Again, habituation. You've gotten used to that stimulus, and so you just don't respond to it as strongly anymore. Now, in contrast, there's also sensitization, which is on the other side of the coin, where you respond more strongly over time. And so let's see, what would be a good part of this? When you start to learn to make connections between things. And so you learn that, let's say, for example, you aren't familiar with a lightning siren. Like, do they still have those now? Like, there's a lightning in the area, so a siren goes off when you're a kid and tells you to go inside. Well, maybe the first time you hear it, you don't even really think about it too much. But then over time, you start to make the connection between the siren and between the oncoming storm. And so over time, you're thinking about it more. You respond more strongly over time. Again, these are just different examples, common examples of how we learn. But now, importantly, learning is not defined by the stimulus itself. It is defined by the response to the stimulus. That's where the learning actually occurs. So when we're really looking at here in this chapter, before we talked about perception, we talked about how people respond to and interpret those stimuli. We are really interested here in that response factor. How does that response change over time in response to something? So one of the dominant themes that or theories that we're going to talk about today in terms of how do people learn and how do people end up making these changes to the behavior is in classical conditioning. And which is the classical example. You might be familiar with Pavlov's dogs. So we're going to watch a cute video for a second here, but just as a little bit of a gateway into it. Really, when we talk about classical conditioning, we are talking about learning through association and only through association. There isn't a more critical process. There's no higher level thinking. It's just A and B tend to co-occur, so you learn to associate them. That is classical conditioning. So let's go over to my Chrome window. Let's see. Let's get Chrome up here. Boop boop boop. There's Chrome. All right. Hi Chrome. Everyone say hello to Chrome. All right. We are going to talk about Pavlov and a very special experiment that he did that basically redefined and really defined how we understand learning.
In 1904, as this original footage shows,
I hate listening to Philip Zimbardo.
in digestion and the action of the salivary glands. By diverting the saliva of dogs into test tubes, he could precisely measure if and how much they salivated during digestion. When food was presented, the dog salivated quickly.
Look at that dog.
Salivary reflex.
What a good boy.
But over repeated testings, a strange thing happened. The dog salivated before contact with the food. Just the sight of the food was enough to stimulate their drooling. Then, just seeing the food dish, or even hearing the footsteps of Pavlov or his assistants, was enough to trigger this built-in reflex. What was going on to elicit this response? Pavlov decided to find out by systematically varying the stimuli and measuring the dog's reaction. Metronomes, lights, and bells were all used as stimuli, and they all worked as stand-ins for the food. What mattered was not the kind of stimulus that was used, but the fact that it reliably signaled that food was on the way.
I love this illustration so much.
A fundamental type of learning called classical conditioning. An original stimulus elicits an automatic unlearned response. Both stimulus and response.
I should make this a point reward. It's animation.
Then a second, neutral stimulus that never elicits the unconditioned response by itself is introduced just before the presentation of the original stimulus. If the neutral or signaling stimulus is presented alone, and a response occurs as if the original stimulus were still there, we say that conditioning has taken place. The arbitrary neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. The reverse is also true. Pavlov and others studied the extinction over time of such conditioned responses. When the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus no longer signals a desired event, the acquisition process is reversed, as the learned connection is gradually weakened. Pavlov's work...
All right, let's not let Philip Zimbardo talk any longer than he needs to. So I should probably put this out here. So when I was in grad school, let's see. First, Philip Zimbardo. If you're familiar with the Stanford Prison Study, this is the guy who did it. He later on became the president of the American Psychological Association and is also a dirty old man. When I was in grad school, there was another student that I was in courses with and who brought up that while she was at a APA conference, they trot him out every now and then because, he's famous living psychologist. And he, as a dirty old man, was asking these, at the time, undergraduates, like barely into their 20s, asking them to sit on his lap. Like, sincerely, fuck this guy. Absolutely fuck this guy. But anyway, let's get back to a more pleasant conversation. I think that's the last time that we're going to see him, at least in this lecture. All right. So Pavlov's dogs, classic example of classical conditioning. Really, literally the textbook example. And it's something that people see all the time. Like I even see in the chat here, and it's like where you start seeing you can see this all over the time, right? Like all over the place. So in my own example with my own dog, there is nothing in this world that she loves more than cheese. And she has learned that whenever I go into the fridge, if she stands and she waits and begs, I may give her cheese. And now, even when I just go to and what I found is that even when I just go and open the fridge, if she's standing there, she starts drooling. Because she's now a bit conditioned to think that if I stand here next to the fridge door and you open it, you're going to give me cheese. And in the anticipation of that cheese, she starts drooling on the floor. And it's just wonderful. It's adorable. I love my dog. So how do we really break this one down? No, I still get pets later. Don't worry about it. So when we talk about classical conditioning, there are really 5 things that I want to talk about. And that is the neutral stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response. Actually, let me, I'll get to that one. Since you spent the points. Yeah, like another good example is that my dog runs to the door whenever I pick up my keys. Doesn't matter where I'm going. It's just the connection between me picking up my keys is enough to signal that she thinks she's going outside, so she runs to the door. So how do we break this down then? All these terms came up. So let's look at this in a context. So all these came up in the video. You start with an unconditioned stimulus, which is they're going to elicit the unconditioned response. Dogs salivate in the presence of food no matter what. It is not something that requires any associative learning in order to happen. And now you pair a previously neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. So you have the ticking of a metronome, or the case of the bell ringing. You pair that again and again. So you ring the bell, which again doesn't elicit any response, and you keep ringing it while also presenting food, which does elicit a response. Over time, the association in the dog's brain causes them to produce the previously unconditioned response, which is the response to the presentation of food, but to now show it in response to the metronome, meaning that the previously neutral stimulus we would call now the conditioned stimulus, and the previously unconditioned response we would call the conditioned response. In practice, it looks a little bit like this. This dog is adorable, and I love these illustrations. This is my favorite lecture because I get to show you all a lot of dogs, really. So, neutral stimulus is the metronome. Originally, it doesn't do anything. From the jump, the dog does not respond at all to the metronome's presence, but over repeated pairing of the meat with the metronome, gradually the dog will learn to associate the metronome and the food, which will cause it to drool, and then when you take the food away, well, it's still drooling. In much the same way that a VTuber might be conditioned by social media, so that when, let's say, this hypothetical dear VTuber, who is definitely not me, at first, the ringing of a phone does not elicit any joy. But over time, the vibration of the phone is paired with attention on social media, causing the previously unconditioned response of the release of dopamine, aka the good chemicals, and it's like to now be elicited not only by getting attention, but now just by the phone ringing. And it's kind of neat, right? It's like this happens to us all the time. And it's like, this is like sitting down and trying to think of what's a goofy example I could use. Also produce this for me. And I'm like, you know what? This is real. I didn't used to respond to my phone vibrating this way, but I push notifications, especially from social media and retweets and everything, have conditioned me to think that, oh yeah, like my phone vibrates. It's like, oh, that's a notification. Got to go check that. Or like, oh boy, attention. It's like, it happens to us all the time. And we don't have to think about it. That's the interesting thing about classical conditioning. There's no higher level process involved. It just happens over time. It's just associations. And it's like, and the same thing can happen when it comes to stuff like conditioned taste aversion. So who here, you don't, like, I guess you can't show me your hands since this is an actual classroom, but you might have, let's see, if you've ever gotten food poisoning, have you ever eaten that food again? Like, just think about that for a second. Or if you've had something and it made you sick, it's like, did you find that you had an aversion to it, or you didn't really want to eat that thing, at least for a long time? So what people find typically is that it actually takes shockingly few pairings in order to develop a taste aversion. So let's say you have some leftover chili in the fridge. It's been like a week and a half, but it's still good, right? So you heat it up and you eat it. What you might find is that what's going to happen is you very quickly develop an aversion to probably eating chili again. Now, also what's interesting about this is people are very, very good at picking out what made them sick. So if you, for example, had a full course meal and it's the fish that made you sick, let's say you had like salmon, it was underprepared, it made you sick. People, even if they had say they had drinks and they had maybe some potatoes, maybe like a salad or whatnot, are very, very good at picking out that it is the fish that made me sick and then developing a taste aversion to this. Now, in the lab, this is put together by, let's say, for giving let's say a rat just a saccharin solution, a salt solution. It has a taste to it. Maybe they have some citric acid in it. It tastes lemony or something. And so they flavor the water. The rat drinks it. Then they give the rat an injection that makes it sick, that makes them nauseous. Well, what they find then is that later on, even after maybe one trial, that rat will not go back to drink the delicious saccharin solution. Even if it's the sugar water, it's something that the rat would ordinarily really want. Just usually 1 or 2 trials is enough to develop a taste aversion. And these tend to also endure for quite a while. Like Brandon brought up in chat that it took years to get over a taste aversion. And even stuff like that too, with like if you've had or if you're eating a food and you cut yourself on it, like if you're like me and around my age, maybe you have that cereal Oreo O's that was horrible for cutting up your mouth. I had it once and didn't ever want to have it again because I cut my mouth up so bad eating it. So the general principles of classical conditioning are pretty straightforward in that there is an acquisition phase. This is something that came up in there. Yeah, I know Oreo O's were the absolute worst. I'm not shocked they don't make them anymore. They were basically like, oh God. It was like what people told us was going to happen when we ate our Halloween candy growing up. So classical conditioning, a couple different terms here. They came up in the video, but let's go over them again. At first, there is an acquisition phase where you learn to associate the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus. There is an extinction phase where if you keep putting together the conditioned stimulus, remember like the metronome or ringing the bell, but you don't actually also present the food, eventually the association breaks down. And we talked about this with associative learning before as well, in this series and a couple of other things we've done on YouTube. But over time, people just will gradually stop associating the two things. And if the basis of classical conditioning is association, well, you can kind of guess what happens. So let's think about that. I'm going to shift my display capture down a little bit because that is a little bit off. All right, there we go. Now, what's interesting, though, is that even after you've gone through a whole phase of extinction and the conditioned response no longer happens in response to the conditioned stimulus, so the bell is no longer making the dog salivate because it's learned not to associate the bell and the food anymore, there is an interesting quirk called spontaneous recovery, where after breaking down that connection, it can spontaneously reappear over time. It's like, or can be relearned faster than it was learned before. So let's say it took a dozen attempts, a dozen cycles to associate the metronome and the food powder before. Well, now it might only take 1 or 2 because that association kind of does still exist in memory. Remember, we've talked about long-term memory and how as we develop associations and we develop memories, our brains literally change. We develop new neurons and neural pathways, which helps explain spontaneous recovery. You have the learning mechanisms, the foundations of that connection are already are hardwired into your brain after learning them, and they can represent themselves after a period of time. Take a sip of my nice herbal tea, and this is what it looks like in practice. Over time, the conditioned response is going to become stronger over time, and then if you start breaking down the association, it's going to degrade over time. Now, what's interesting is that we talk about stimulus generalization a little bit, and that's to say that generally when people learn things in terms of classical conditioning, they don't tend to be very specific about the stimuli. So it might just be a bell. Like it's or the one ringtone in your phone. Let's go back to the attention example. My phone rings and I associate that with a retweet, which makes me, my brain flood with parasocial chemicals that induce a state of euphoria. But then over time, what I find is that I get the same response even when my phone is on vibrate. It's like the connection that was originally between the phone ringing and the dopamine has now been broken down and expanded to also include the phone being on vibrate, or maybe it's the bell, but then it's that elicits a drooling response, but then it's chimes, so on and so forth. So let's go into one of the most terrifying and worst examples of misconduct, I think, in the history of academic psychology. Way back before we had institutional review boards, way back before we had anything to do to like anyone to say no, there was little Albert, also known as baby Albert in some cases. Little Albert is a very interesting story in the experiments of classical conditioning, foundational, really, and also the understanding of phobias. But let's just say that way back when they were doing this experiment at Penn State, they didn't have an IRB to say maybe it's not okay to induce phobias in a baby. And this is how we got here. Let's sit tight. Watson's famous study before she joined HoloLive.
Psychologists John Watson and Rosalie Rayner set out to teach a baby boy called Little Albert to fear white rats using the principle of classical conditioning. This is a film of their work. The film shows several phases of their study. First, as you see here, the investigators demonstrated that prior to conditioning, Little Albert had no fears of any animals, including, of course, white rats.
What a good dog. There's so many dogs in this lecture. I love it. What a good dog. That's such a happy dog. What a good boy. What a good boy. Oh. Oh, that's a good dog. Watson is a monster for making this child afraid of dogs. Mm-hmm. And so basically over time, there's actually no audio in this. This was recorded before the talkies, I believe they were called. So unfortunately, there is no audio here to go along with this.
Watson and Rayner then sought to teach Albert to fear white rats through classical conditioning. In the conditioning phase of the study, which was not filmed, the investigators struck a steel bar with a hammer whenever Albert reached for a rat, making a very loud noise that greatly upset and frightened Albert. After 6 such pairings of the loud noise and the rat, it was believed that the boy had been conditioned to fear white rats. That is, Albert was now expected to react fearfully to white rats whether the rats were paired with loud noises or not. In this next film sequence, we see Albert interacting with a white rat after the conditioning process. The investigators believed that the child's reaction during this trial demonstrated his newly acquired fear of white rats. Finally, the investigators expected that little Albert's conditioned fear of white rats would generalize to stimuli that were similar in key ways to a white rat. In this film segment, they were trying to demonstrate that the child now also reacted fearfully to similar objects, such as a rabbit, a dog, a furry object, and a white mask worn by Watson himself.
I have a lot of contempt for John Watson. Look at yanking that dog around. I'm getting like a little upset actually. Yeah, and then this is actually supposed to be like a Santa Claus mask, at least what it was taught in my Psych 101 textbook. It does not look like one at all. I don't know where they got that from. But yeah, basically, before IRBs, John Watson and his assistants sat down and said, what if we just like made a baby afraid of fluffy things? Like that was just a normal thing that a person should do. And then, so, like, according to their own measures, they did it. So what's interesting about this is that because this was before IRBs, there was never a debriefing process, and no one really knows what happened to little Albert over time. He just kind of got out of the system. They finished the study, and then Albert was kind of let out into the world, presumably based on the tenets of classical conditioning. The induced fear probably didn't hold for very long. I mean, after all, most dogs are good. So, and as someone who got bit in the face by a dog, but now absolutely loves them, I'm gonna go ahead and I choose to believe that Albert probably got over it. But it's a very interesting experiment, right? One, because of its absurdity, but also just how over just 6 trials they were able to make this baby afraid of fuzzy things. Now, the interesting thing here is that phobias and fears that are and how they're maintained, there's a long list of them overall. If you actually go to phobialist.com, I'm going to drop it in chat as well, you can find a long list of things that people have developed conditional fears of. Stuff like the fear of staying, like anutophobia, the fear of staying single. The cholorophobia, the fear of anger, or the fear of cholera. Let's see. Fear of electricity, fear of having a fever. Fibriophobia. Let's see. Gynophobia, fear of nudity. Gynophobia, fear of women. Nauseophobia, the fear of knowledge. Let's see. Kleptophobia, the fear of stealing. These are all things that people just put in. So what actually defines a phobia? That's a good question. So, Now, what defines a phobia, because that's a good point there. So let's say a fear of heights. There is a fear of heights, which is adaptive because heights are like you said, are for real dangerous, Tom. Now, what defines a phobia is a disproportionate response to the relative stimulus. It is normal to be afraid if you are, let's say, jumping out of a plane and you are skydiving, to feel anxious. It is weird. It's actually almost more troubling if you don't. Now, if you were to say, for example, get a couple steps up on a ladder or be like a couple floors up in a building and have an intense anxiety reaction, then someone might turn around and say, all right, well, that seems like that's a little bit out of proportion. So it's the disproportionate response in relative to the stimulus that defines a phobia relative to just a normal fear. Does that make sense? I'm gonna let's search for a couple things. Fear of deer does not exist. Fear of VTubers does not exist. Fear of VTuber deer also does not exist. Hershiophobia does not exist yet. I have work to do. All right, back to all the fun of lecturing. Let's see. Let's go. Yeah, it does not exist yet. So in the inverse, though, so there's generalization, where a person might respond, like a disproportionate fear of VTubers. I'm already working on developing it myself. Now, there's generalization, where it tends to spread out. And like in Albert's case, initially the exposure was to a rat, but then gradually branched out to dogs, rabbits, masks, anything fuzzy. Now, discrimination is when it becomes more focused or stays restricted to one thing. So in this case, again, like if you do the metronome and you have the ticking, but let's say in that it elicits the drooling response in response to exposure to food. But if now the metronome is played at a different tempo and that doesn't produce the same response, well, then we would say that the stimulus discrimination is occurring. Now, here's the fun thing, is you can actually chain behaviors together. So you can create a conditioned response and then pair it with something that was previously neutral and basically chain things together. And we call this higher order conditioning, and it can work up to about 3 levels. We're going to revisit this a bit when we talk about conditioning animals, because when you see those really cool and really impressive dog tricks, like dogs that are able to change CDs in a CD player, they are usually showing off higher order conditioning, and that they are able to do very complicated behaviors by actually linking together a set of conditioned stimuli and responses. Now, over time, though, the links in the chain get weaker and are more prone to extinction. All right, time for operant conditioning. Before I get there, any questions at all about classical conditioning? All right, let's get into it. Operant conditioning. Operant conditioning. A lot to be said about operant conditioning. It's I think it's a little bit more complicated than classical conditioning. Also is applicable, and there's a reason that we teach both, because they cover different facets of learning. So just like with our frame traps, classical conditioning, only if they stop mashing. Remember, learning is defined by a change in behavior. If the person doesn't stop mashing in response to your frame traps, they are not being conditioned. So, how do we define operant condition? Again, we're thinking about changes in behavior, not now due to associations, but due to rewards and punishments. And this is interestingly because, again, it's contingent on behavior and is voluntary. And it relies on what is defined as a law of effect. If a stimulus leads to a desirable outcome, then that behavior is more likely to be repeated in the future so long as that stimulus is present. If you study a lot and you get a good grade, you're more likely to study a lot in the future. If you tune in to my stream and I tell you that I appreciate you being there, you might come back. It's basically, now we're shifting to consequence as a tool of learning and not just mere association. So in classical conditioning, again, what we're thinking about is conditioned and unconditioned responses, kind of almost like reflexes, and how we learn to apply reflexes to different situations. These are automatic points. The reward is unconditional. It's just that response is going to happen. And it depends primarily on the automatic nervous system. I don't totally agree with this section of it, but I don't get to say what's in textbooks. I would say focus on the first two rows here. In operant conditioning, again, it's voluntary behavior. There's more room for the organism to think and process information. It's a little bit more cognitive, although we'll talk about how Skinner would disagree with me. And it is, again, contingent on behavior and outcomes. So let's head over to the Skinner box and have B.F. Skinner himself explain to us what the Skinner box actually is. Let's see, boop ba doop boop ba boop boom boom. Here we go. Here we go. All right. You're probably familiar with these. So the Skinner box is developed by B.F. Skinner as a tool for learning. He's going to explain it here. But basically, in early trials, what they would do is put rats, put pigeons, put animals in these boxes, and then see if they could structure that box, build that box in such a way that it would change the animal's behavior over time. Let's put on those closed captions too.
Can pigeons read? This one gives every indication, because he's been taught to distinguish between two words and to behave appropriately. He's learned his different response to each sign by being rewarded with food. So the bird isn't acting independently. Its behavior is shaped by controlling its environment.
Now you might remember Clever Hans from, I want to say, the second chapter here, the horse that people thought could count. This is again an example of operant conditioning. Now in that case, the horse's behavior had been conditioned by the positive response of its owner in response to it tapping a signaled number of times. So again, the same question, can this pigeon read? Is it really thinking critically here, or is it just responding to its environment? Well, that's what operant conditioning really refers to.
The first task was to isolate an individual piece of behavior and see how that could be changed. Skinner did this by keeping individual pigeons at about 3/4 of their normal weight, so that the birds were always hungry, and food could be used as an automatic reward. The pigeon was studied in a uniform box, one it quickly grew used to. One piece of behavior, pecking a coloured disc, was measured on a graph.
Let's see. In theory, the pigeon would do the same thing. Question from the class. And in theory, the pigeon would do the same thing even if the word said something else, as long as the food reward was consistent. Yes. So we would say that this is not a critical behavior. There is a higher language process happening. That is just a conditioned response.
pigeon learned that pecking the disc produced a reward. Then the behavior of pecking could be studied in relation to how often that reward was offered. Or in Skinner's terms, what was the schedule of reinforcement?
The main thing is what we call schedules of reinforcement. Reinforcement is what the layman calls reward, and you can schedule it so that a reward occurs every now and then when a pigeon does something. We usually use a response with a pigeon pecking a little disc, a little spot in the wall, and you can reinforce with food, but you don't reinforce every time. Perhaps every 10th time, or perhaps only once every minute or something like that. There are a very large number of schedules, and they have their special effects. And there is a good example of how you can move from the pigeon to the human case, because one of the schedules which is very effective with rats or pigeons is what we call the variable ratio schedule, and that is at the heart of all
Gotcha
gambling
machines.
and it has the same effect. A pigeon can become a pathological gambler just as a person can. Now, the fact that we found that out with pigeons and could prove it by removing and changing the schedule makes it easy for us to interpret the case with the human subject. We don't say that the human subject gambles to punish himself, as the Freudians might say, or gambles because he feels excited when he does so. Nothing of the sort. People gamble because of the schedule of the reinforcement that follows. And this is true of all gambling systems. They all have variable ratios built into them. So what we've learned from the pigeon, it made it possible to interpret this vast field very effectively.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. But now we're gonna like we can talk a little bit about I'm gonna actually specifically hold that thought. Is Skinner the evil mastermind behind Genshin Impact? We are specifically going to talk about that. I have a fun story. The short answer is yes. We just talked about the Skinner in classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So we're getting into Skinner boxes and all that. So here's the fun thing about all this. So Skinner, this is background. He's going to get into a little bit more in this next section that I don't think we really need to get into now. But largely, Skinner is not only just associated with behaviorism, which is a experimental orientation in psychology. He is also the spearhead of what we call radical behaviorism, which is a very hardline theoretical stance that basically we are only ever responding to our environment. And so Skinner, over time, through his experiments, developed a worldview that basically it doesn't matter what the cognition or the higher level thinking a person goes into in terms of understanding their behavior. It was only a matter of stimulus and response. So he's an interesting figure in the history of psychology because we'll talk a bit more about the legacy of it, but like he's had a tremendous impact. And some argue maybe for the worse. But it's hard to talk about learning without talking about Skinner at some point. I personally think that it's radical behaviorism aside, have fascinating ideas and cool boxes, I guess. So operant conditioning. Again, we talked about that a little bit more in the video. The core mechanism here is reinforcement. The outcome of a positive reinforcement is by getting a desirable stimulus. In the case of the pigeon, they do the behavior, they get the food is the desirable stimulus, it reinforces the behavior, causing them to do the behavior more frequently in the future. Now, a negative form of reinforcement though, so this is interesting. Think about a 2x2 grid. We have reinforcements and punishment, we have positive and negative on the X and the Y axis. Think about it like a 4 grid, like 4 squares in a box. It's a 2x2 grid. Positive reinforcement, you give something, making it positive, you're adding, and it makes the behavior more likely to occur in the future. A negative reinforcement is taking away something negative. This is a harder one to visualize. So let's just say that you play really loud music and you're in your college dorm room, and your neighbor plays really loud music until you come up and you knock on their door and you are very polite. Well, by you being polite, and then they remove the loud music so you can sleep, it makes you more likely to be polite to them in the future. That's one example. Basically, removing something harmful to increase the likelihood of a behavior happening in the future. Now, punishment is an interesting piece. We talk about punishment a lot. It comes up a lot in like parenting and teaching, like teaching manuals, parenting manuals, all that. Really, a punishment is any outcome that decreases the probability of a behavior happening in the future. And that can be positive punishment, where you add something undesirable. And there can be negative punishment, where you remove something desirable from the situation. So a timeout, taking someone away from their, like taking away their toy or something like that, that's negative punishment. Positive punishment would be maybe scolding somebody. Now, here's the thing though, because it's only punishment, remember, because it's all about outcome, right? It is only punishment if it reduces the likelihood of the behavior occurring in the future. So, if, for example, a kid is acting out and you scold them, but they actually act out more in the future because what they really wanted was attention, well, then you scolding them wasn't actually a punishment. It was actually a reward. Interesting, right? So it's like, again, we're talking about conditioning, we're talking about outcomes, and if the outcome isn't changing the frequency of behavior, well, in a positive or negative direction, well, then it's not, doesn't matter what the intention was. What matters is the actual outcome. If you give someone the attention and that's what they really wanted, you just act out more. And there's individual differences in this as well. You know, when I was in grad school, I made the mistake of fostering a puppy for a while. And she was a mutt. She was adorable. But I learned very quickly that she was a hound because she would yowl. And she would yowl all night. The only thing I could do, I tried scolding her, but she just did it more because she wanted attention. Eventually, I was sleeping in the same room as her because she couldn't stand to be alone at night. And that's when I realized that I probably shouldn't have a puppy in grad school. And I was only fostering her, so she went back to the shelter. But it was an important lesson for me in learning, in that, you know, every now and then things that I thought would be corrective to what the puppy was doing ended up reinforcing it because all they really wanted was to not be alone. So yeah, it's an interesting quirk. And that's something that's always very important to think about when you're trying to condition somebody. You're trying to think about, especially as an instructor, as a parent, like how do you teach people? How do you instruct people? Well, sometimes what you really have to think about is what are they thinking and how are they responding to you in order to be an effective teacher. Yeah. This is just a quick breakdown of this. So remember, positive reinforcement, positive added something, reinforcement increases the likelihood of the behavior happening. Giving someone a gold star, making someone a mod on your Twitch channel. It's basically how you would go about a positive reinforcement. A negative reinforcement, this is a good example that I forgot about. You have a really bad internet connection or a really bad Wi-Fi connection unless you're standing right next to the router. So you end up just standing next to the router more often. Positive punishment, again, positive adding something, punishment, you want to decrease the likelihood of the behavior happening. Scolding a pet to reduce the behavior. Or negative punishment, taking away something, taking away a favorite toy, taking away, putting someone in timeout. Again, negative, taking something away, punishment, so that to reduce the likelihood of the behavior happening in the future. Now, another fun thing about punishment, not so fun, but important to note, is that it is actually very often less effective than reinforcement, because punishment doesn't actually instruct someone on what to do, it only tells them what not to do. And you think about, like, it makes sense, right? If you put yourself in this position, if you find yourself getting punished very frequently, but in the absence of reward, you don't know what to do. You just know how not to do things wrong. And as a consequence, this can create anxiety because you don't know what the right thing to do is. And if you don't know what the right thing to do is, well, how are you going to avoid getting punished? You don't know what you're supposed to be doing. So in the presence of punishment, what some people learn is actually, it's not about what to do right. It's about not getting caught. It's about being subversive. And it can also model aggressive behaviors. So if a person starts to act out or feel frustrated because they don't know what the right answer to do is, yeah, it can lead to frustration. It can lead to aggressive behaviors, subversive behaviors. So the thing, like punishment, for some reason, people seem to think, and like when I was growing up, I remember the discourse really kicking off in parenting magazines about should you spank your child? And a lot of the arguments were pulling from this literature and saying, if you just spank your kid, it doesn't actually teach them what to do. You're just going to make them anxious and afraid that whatever they're going to do is going to get them spanked. What you need to do is reward positive behavior more so than punishing people harshly. So there is still, the idea of generalization and discrimination does still exist in operant conditioning. Now, they work a little bit differently though. So a discriminate stimulus or a discriminative stimulus signals an opportunity that reinforcement might occur. So over time, let's say there are two lights, and there's two lights in the Skinner box. There's a green light and a red light. Over time, this rat was going to learn that by pressing the bar down, when the green light is lit, that's only then food will drop. They drop down into their feeding tray, not when the red light is lit. Yeah, that's actually a really good one there. Also true with a lot of pet training as well, and also with people. So like the example here Tom brought up here is why you should never scold your tortoise when they destroy stuff via digging, because they don't know what they did wrong. It's the same thing even with dogs and animals that have bigger brains. Like people always say, oh, you know, don't rub if your dog pees in the house, don't rub their nose in it. Part of it is because by punishing them, they don't know what they did wrong. They just know that now they're being punished. Rather, if you want to housebreak your animal, you should praise them for going outside more so than punish them for going inside. You're gonna get much better results than that. Because think about it, like you punish them because your dog peed in the living room. They might just go pee in the bedroom now because they don't understand. What you need to do is reward them for going outside. Yeah, like the thing, if you reward the animal when they do a behavior, they're going to be much more likely to learn that desired behavior than if you punish them for not doing the thing you wanted them to do. All right, so discriminated stimulus, again, it signals the opportunity for reward. So red light, green light, eventually the animal will learn that this only happens when the green light happens. There's a contingency to the behavior. Yeah, also true that for a lot of people, again, there's an element of associative learning in operant conditioning. So if we see in the case of dogs that don't have a strong sense of time, if you punish them after the fact, it just causes anxiety. They don't know what they did and they don't make the connection. Remember, it's about reward and it's about understanding cause and effect. If the dog doesn't know, you come home, they peed in the living room 2 hours ago while you were out doing your errands, they don't know what they did. They aren't making the connection between why they are being punished now and that earlier behavior, which just is going to create anxiety and make it harder to train them later on. All right, so schedules of reinforcement. Skinner brought about this. There are two broad categories. One is continuous reinforcement. So like how often do you give the food to the pigeon? Do you give it every time that it pecks? That's continuous reinforcement. Or do you do it only some of the time? And that's partial reinforcement. Now, over time, remember, extinction also exists here. So over time, again, the animal, the person will learn the contingency. But if you start to break that down, again, just like with classical conditioning, it will start to dissipate over time. Now, the one way to combat that and create very strong conditioned responses using operant conditioning is to only reward the behavior some of the time. Because now that the person or the animal doesn't expect the reward every time, if they do the behavior and they don't get the desired response, it's not really going to be a chalk against it. So there are two different ways to think about this in terms of fixed versus variable. And now you can think about a fixed ratio, and that is you're going to get fed every 10 button presses. Variable ratio. Everywhere, anytime between 5 to 15 bar presses, you get fed. And it's going to randomly vary around an average number. Fixed interval is based on time. Every half hour, the first bar press will get you fed. Or variable interval, every 15 to 45 minutes, randomly chosen around that 30-minute mark, the first bar press is going to get the animal fed. So how do these work in terms of training? Far and away, variable ratio, again, that is the one where it is a randomly determined number around an average number of actions is going to get you the reward. It's far and away the most resilient way to condition somebody, and also the fastest way to condition a response, followed by the fixed ratio, variable interval, and then fixed interval. Now here's the interesting thing about this. What you see over time, though, is that variable ratios, very fast learning, and the behavior is just consistently performed over time. There's no dips or drops off. Now, with fixed ratio, again, remember where they know that it's every 10 presses. Over time, the animal will just like kind of not do it for a while and then very quickly catch up and then not do it and then do it a bunch and then not do it and then do it a bunch. It creates an inconsistent pattern of behavior. So what we're really getting to here is that, again, variable ratio, it's what Skinner brought up there. This is gambling. Variable ratio is just gambling. You hit a slot machine, you don't know when you are going to get it. You don't know when the reward is going to come. You know you're going to win eventually, so you just keep putting money into the machine. Operant conditioning is incredibly good at producing gambling responses and gambling addictions and explaining how gambling addictions develop. Our brains are just attuned to put money into slot machines. It's how we learn. A large portion of how we understand our environments is based on this schedule of reinforcement, and gambling, especially slots, poker, etc., just take advantage of this so efficiently. It's remarkable. Let's see, and I've got one more video from our good buddy Skinner here. Let's talk about shaping for a bit, and then we get to look at cute video. It's only cute videos from now on, I promise. So I talked about, remember, the complicated dog training videos? Skinner explains these by shaping. Now, classical conditioning would talk about higher order connections people are making. Skinner talks about shaping.
And I will try to pick out some particular pattern of behavior and make it a more frequent part of the repertoire of the bird. Very fine. This bird has been already conditioned to eat when the magazine sounds and the light flashes. Now we'll just watch its behavior a bit.
Make it a bit louder.
It's not doing anything in particular, you see. But I'm going to try to get it to do something. Suppose I shape up the behavior of making a complete turn. What I do is simply, as I did then, to wait for some part of that behavior. There's more of it, you see. You can see that the effect is instantaneous. I'm waiting for it to turn counterclockwise now. And then I reinforce that movement. And I wait for a more pronounced movement than that. It's got to be more than that. There we go, all the way around.
Taught a bird to spin. He turned a bird into a Beyblade. So this is what we're talking about when we come to operant conditioning is kind of the same principle. How do we explain more complicated behaviors? Well, one way is to look at this and say, well, we've got classical conditioning, which is going to say that it's a combination of conditioned responses that you build up over time. However, operant conditioning in Skinner and behaviorists would say, no, it's what we talk about this is chaining and shaping. It's rewarding progressively closer approximations to a desired behavior, and it doesn't have to be conditioned in terms of just associations. It can be handled through reward and contingencies. So it's a little bit different. It's ultimately the same response. It's how we explain, again, like the more complicated dog training tricks. It's also how we explain, bum-ba-da-bum, some of you already figured this out, gacha games. Like, oh wow, I got hit by the chroma key. Let me turn that one off. Some evil Uma Musume. There we go. All right. Uma Musume, Pretty Derby, Fate Grand Order, Genshin Impact, let's see, I already said Fate Grand Order, Grand Blue Fantasy, Arknights, Love Live School Idol Festival, any number of the Idolmaster games. They all pull from operant conditioning, and it is not a mistake. Turns out that a lot of the companies that work on these games have realized that there was a lot of money to be made in understanding how conditioning works and trying to, I'll say what it is, induce a gambling addiction in people who otherwise would not develop one. And it's why, when you look at these games, they make so much fucking money because these companies hire on people like me that have degrees in psychology, sometimes even doctorates. Thank you for the raid. Wow, huge raid. Yeah, this is we're talking about operant conditioning here. We're doing a little bit of a psychology 101 lecture. I lost my train of thought. But anyway, we're talking about gacha games and conditioning. So operant conditioning is a very cool and useful tool that is used for evil sometimes because gacha game companies like the people behind Genshin Impact, Fate Go, all these companies end up using the tenets of operant conditioning pretty consistently and brutally effectively to get people to play these games and to get people to spend money on them in particular. And like, if we go back a little bit, remember we talked about those ratio scales? So you've got the variable ratioable scale, which we talked about is basically a slot machine. You put the money in, you spin the crank, the dials light up, the bells go off, and you know what do you end up with? Well, sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. And you know eventually you'll probably win, but you don't know when it's going to happen. Not that dissimilar from clicking one more roll, one more 10 roll. In fact, you can actually add a lot of these up over time. Because you think about it, how many games have you played, gacha games in particular, that have you get a guaranteed SR or SSR or super rare or super rare, whatever the game calls it, on your 10th roll? Yeah, and odds are that you're going to lose, right? You're not going to, most of them have like a 1 or 2% chance of getting the super rare character on the banner. But again, every 10th roll is guaranteed to be a higher rarity. That's fixed ratio. It's exactly fixed ratio. And then overall, it's in a variable ratio where you don't know what because you still have a chance on every roll to get the cool thing, right? All of it is like, it's not an accident because psychologists like me get hired to help make these games as effective as they can be. Twitter hires psychologists all the time. I know many PhD psychologists that work on Facebook, oftentimes specifically to see how can we get people to spend more time on this website. It's all operant conditioning. Oh gosh, you actually spent less on Genshin than me. Even if you know this, it still works on you. I've spent money on gacha games. I'll put that one on the table. I'm pretty good though. I usually only buy the like in Genshin the whatchamacallit, where you get like 90 gems a day, because that way I know at least I know what I'm getting out of it versus buying straight up rolls. But yeah, it's so deep to get into the gacha hole because it's so easy to get into it, right? It's like you get the spinny lights, you get the cool character, you get the Twitter dopamine when people are like congratulating you, like Shinji at the end of Evangelion for getting the character. Yeah, there's a reason that there's so much commonality between like a slot machine and all this because it's very deliberate. It's set up. Yeah. And the thing is, for some folks, yeah, once you like, and as you go on, and so here's the thing. Because it's operant conditioning, it's a reinforcement schedule, right? Oh, thank you so much. It's a reinforcement schedule. So when you do get the good character, you finally win. And as you spend more, you just get further and further into a hole because the behavior of spending money on there just gets reinforced. It's like, it's easy to go to the slots, put $5 in, play, lose, and walk away. It is much harder to walk away if you win on that first win. If you win, it is so much harder to walk away because the behavior has been reinforced. You like the hooks are in you, and that's what it's like when you start spending money on gacha games and all that. It's how they get you. You get the win, you get the cool character. There you go. Like you've already won once. You've been reinforced. Oof. Oh, you're never done with Genshin. Yeah. And it's like, and you get on the treadmill of trying to get the currency, but then the free currency you get isn't enough, and then you want to get the character, so you keep rolling, and before you know it, you've got a Twitter highlight clip of you spending $1,000 trying to get a character in Idolmaster, and rest in peace, Kivara. All right. So what's fun about this though is like we've been talking predominantly about primary reinforcers. And that is and that's also an important thing to bring up. There's so much to talk about. I think we'll have to wait for office hours to really get into Genshin and other gacha games, but limited time banners are, pardon my words, like I'm usually very say so here, but fucked up. because they take all that same, everything else. They take all the elements of variable ratios and the reinforcement schedules and all that. And then what do you get? They add on top of that, you have limited amounts of time. And sometimes it's like you're guaranteed to get the character if you roll 100 times within that banner, right? But the next banner resets. And so if you've rolled 50 times, but you're out of free currency, well, if you roll 50 times with money, you're guaranteed to get the character. And it's like, it's by adding that time crunch. It's like a whole nother thing. It's like the way that I've seen gacha games develop over time, especially as I see the job postings for different companies that are trying to hire people like me, it's frightening to see how good they have gotten at figuring out ways to hook people into spending money and to keep spending money. Yeah, and that's a smart way to handle it, is to really set rules for yourself and say, I only spend money on certain things. I only spend a certain amount of money or money for certain things. Like I said with Genshin, I tell myself I only buy the thing that gives me the extra free currency every day when I log in. I'm not going to spend money on roles, because then that's like, once I get in there, and especially once that behavior gets reinforced, even if I know that this is what's happening to me, that's not going to stop it from happening. Yeah, it'd be nice if I could just buy characters. Anyway, I'm moving on. So secondary reinforcers are things that can actually lead to reinforcing the behavior, but aren't connected to them directly. So we're talking about like food and rats and stuff in a lot of these cases. But what about money? What about token economies, which are money? Token economies, it's like things that are secondary reinforcers. They don't necessarily lead to reinforcement directly, but like, let's say, for example, let's keep using the gacha example. It works. You aren't necessarily interested in the character, but you love the attention that you get when you tweet about getting the character. So the character is actually a secondary reinforcer. In that case, the primary reinforcer is the attention. You like the attention, the retweets and the faves, the end of Evangelion, congratulations, Shinji, you rolled official. So that's pretty much how it works. So in other words, especially as we're able to think about things more abstractly as people, stuff like money, token economies start to work as well. So there are two different ways. We talked about anxiety and phobias a little bit earlier with little Albert, who's like I said, one of my favorite and least favorite stories of experimental psychology, and I hope that he recovered from being induced to be afraid of the world. Basically, again, he was trained to fear rabbits. He was then, over time, that should extinguish over time. But now here's the thing about the two-process theory. So one theory that I like to stick with is that Albert left that lab. And so for those of you that just joined with the raid, thanks again, Aaron, for the big extra life raid. I hope everything went well. But so little Albert is a baby who was conditioned to be afraid of white rats, because every time he tried to reach for the white rat in the lab, the psychologist that was trying to train him would bang an iron rod with a hammer. It would make a loud sound. It would make Albert cry. Eventually, he associates the loud sound with the rat, but not just the rat. It was anything fuzzy scared him. Now, over time, purely on the tenets of classical conditioning, that should extinguish over time. But that doesn't, it's not like we have two parallel tracks for operant and classical conditioning. They intersect and they weave together. And in this case, the feeling of anxiety that he might have felt upon seeing something fuzzy might have served to continue reinforcing that behavior, even when purely classical models of conditioning would have said that it should have extinguished over time. So how do we get into this a little bit more? We're going to talk about SOR, stimulus organism response theory. So early behaviorists, aka Skinner and his famous boxes that basically invented the empire of gacha games. And if you think the Genshin is bad, just wait till that Hololive gacha game drops, because they've been recruiting game devs, and I can't imagine they're working on much else. So early behaviorists ignored cognition. They were basically like we talked about radical behaviorism there for a second. Skinner very succinctly believed that it did not matter what the organism was thinking. It didn't care. The organism is a black box. The only thing he cared about was stimulus and response, and that's what all he believed in, which is hence why we call him a radical behaviorist, because he felt like it doesn't matter what the person is thinking. What matters is what is happening with them. So, cognitivists later on, like Piaget, brought back in the organism to the model and developed the stimulus-organism response theory. Because remember, we talked about punishment and rewards before, where sometimes the kid is acting out, you go to scold them, but it ends up reinforcing the behavior because what they really wanted was attention. That can't be explained in a radical behaviorist model. It can be explained in the cognitive model that factors in how the individual responds to what's happening to them and how they make sense of it. And personally, that's where I fall. I'm a social cognition person. Cognition's in the name. I care a lot about what people think. So what's interesting about in a couple things, we talked about observed learning here. There's also latent learning or insight-based learning. So what's fun is that learning can happen even if it's not directly observable. So there is an element of developing competence versus performing a behavior. So yeah, you can always do the thing and overall people can see you and you're getting better. That's performance. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you aren't necessarily getting better at something without having to do it or to perform the task. So in other words, reinforcement based on the contingencies that we've talked about before might not actually necessarily be a necessary part of learning. It's one avenue of learning, but it's not the only one. Because Tolman and Hosnick decided to run rats in a maze. And what they did, competence, what they did is they took 3 different groups of rats. And they told these people, I guess they told these rats, they probably told them at some point. I knew many people in grad school that talked to their rats when they were in behaviorist labs. So what they would do is some of the rats were reinforced when they solved the maze, right? That's classic learning. That's textbook operant conditioning. They solve the maze, they get the cheese. Now another group never got paid, never got fed, never got a reward. But a third group only started getting rewards later on down the line. So in the red bar, they were never reinforced. Yeah, they got better over time, but they kind of slacked off after a while, and it didn't seem like they were really learning anymore after a while. The rats that were always reinforced, the orange line, they just kept getting better. They just kept getting over time, which is what you would expect in these other models of learning. But what's interesting is that blue line. So these are the rats that were only fed halfway through the trial. So they were at first, they look exactly like the rats that aren't being fed at all. If they solve the maze, cool. They have no incentive to do so. But the moment that incentive was introduced, they just got so much better so quickly, basically on pace with the rats that were being reinforced the entire time. They just never had an incentive to show it. So what this really shows and challenges in terms of how we understand learning is that we learn in ways that work outside of classical and operant conditioning. It's not just about associations in classical conditioning. It's not just about rewards with operant conditioning. It's about the whole nuances of learning that can include that we don't really even need rewards sometimes. We just need incentive to show the learning that it's happening anyway. I mean, who's amongst us has not felt like, let's say you were not necessarily challenged in class. So you kind of just slacked off and didn't really participate. You weren't really doing the things. Maybe you didn't do the homework, but then the test happens and you ace it because now you're being evaluated. There's an incentive to perform. You were still learning even though you weren't doing the homework and everything beforehand or showing up to class in college, but it doesn't mean you weren't learning. It's why when I teach, I don't require attendance because I'm like, look, I know that you don't have to be here with me telling you that you're doing a good job and giving you homework assignments to know that you're learning. You can do it on your own. I don't take attendance. I don't give assignments or anything. I just, I have my exams and that's the class. Look, just show me you learned. That's about it. Yeah. I think it's it's a good example. When someone's if I see someone in the back of class and they're just playing solitaire or doing whatever, some professors would call them out and tell them to go home and yo, just do what you want to do. Like, I'm gonna be here. Like, my philosophy on teaching is like, I'm gonna be here no matter what. Like, I think this is fun. I'm doing this on my free time as a VTuber. I think teaching is fun. I'm going to do it. If you want to show up, cool. If you want to stay home, cool. The slides are going to be online anyway. So just like study for the test. That's all I ask. All right. So observational learning, again, also challenges the strict dichotomy of operant and classical conditioning, because turns out we don't even actually have to be reinforced ourselves in order to learn behavior. It turns out you can just watch someone else be reinforced, and that is enough to basically reinforce behavior on your behalf. So the classic example that people use is Bandura's Bobo doll experiment. So in this case, kids were shown a video of an adult beating up a doll, a Bobo doll. You know, like you punch it and it falls backward and it comes back, and you know, it's like a stress release thing. Well, they would watch this person beat this thing up, and then the person would be given a candy or rewarded at the end of the video. And then they would put the kids in the same room with the doll that they just watched this video of the person beating it up, and they would just beat the crap out of the doll. They didn't have to be reinforced. They had learned this behavior by watching someone else be reinforced for it. So let's talk about media and aggression. It's a good segue. There are mountains and mountains and mountains and mountains of research on this one. It turns out that there's been a lot of incentive to understand the effect of media violence on people's behavior. And in general, people that tend to watch violent TV tend to also be people that behave more aggressively. But that's a correlation which we know from earlier installments in the series is not causation. People can be more aggressive and they like more aggressive things. There's and it's not even really that strong of a correlation. It's just a significant correlation. There is some causal evidence that watching violent media can cause aggression, but that's only one piece of a very complicated puzzle. All the research on media and aggression basically comes down to it's complicated. The exact p-value, good question. I'm going to say it's 0.05 somewhere. Usually 0.05 is a good way to look at it. But the more important thing is that, as we also know, p-values are very easy to bias by sample size. It's a weak correlation, and it's very complicated because remember the SOR, stimulus organism response model? People respond differently. People can be critical of the things that they consume. So this idea that there is a one-to-one correlation between you are exposed to violent media, ergo then you are going to be violent, is just not accurate. It doesn't hold up. It's not real. I don't care. You know, I played a lot of Doom. I'm basically harmless. So I've always been critical. Even as a kid, I was critical of this. And then as a researcher, I just become more critical of it. There's a lot of research. A lot of it is bonk. And it's very complicated. And it's like trying to make a causal relationship that violent media causes violence is just like, it's preposterous on face to me. The next time you hear somebody say that, just remember that your favorite Dr. VTuber also said that it was bonk. Now, what is cool, though, about observational learning, now I'm not going to say that there's a connection between media and violence. What I am going to say is that our brains actually have a whole network of super cool neurons called mirror neurons, and they fire when we watch other people doing things. So I watched a deer talk about dogs on Twitch, and they said the violence of the cause. Violent video games don't cause violence. I guess that's really what's happening here, isn't it? Yeah, so mirror neurons. These are fucking cool, and they're relatively recent things that came up in like the last 20 or so years that have a heavy implication empathy as well. So like when you are watching somebody perform a task, the neurons in your brain that would fire when you were performing that task are also firing. Now, you're not doing the same thing. But let's say, for example, you're watching someone play soccer. The motor neurons in your brain that would be moving to orchestrate similar movements are actually happening in your brain at the same time as you are watching that person. And over time, that facilitates learning and coordination and all that. So like watching other people play games is a way of learning how to play games. Watching people play sports is a way of getting better at sports. Reviewing footage of yourself doing a sport or activity is a way to get better at this. Even when you see Weightlifters will do this for form pretty regularly. They'll take videos or have videos of people doing, the proper form for a squat, a deadlift, etc. And this is why. because watching that, even just watching the person and seeing how their body is aligned and moving, is causing neurons in your brain to fire that are going to allow you to be better prepared to imitate that action later on. We have a whole neural system designed to develop these new turns, these kinds of systems in this avenue of learning. And it blows my mind. It's so cool. It's so cool. Yeah, and like Dosing said, it explains a lot of things. Like, there are so many moments in my life where I'm like, I'll watch somebody do something a bunch and then pick it up, and despite having never done it before, it feels like it makes sense. Yeah. Cool beans. All right. Insight learning. We're coming towards the end here. I got a couple more fun animal videos here. But Kohler's chimpanzees and aha moments. Let's see. So basically, this kind of comes back to latent learning. And it's like, we think about learning sometimes in classical models and operant models as being contingent on rewards and things happening immediately. Well, it turns out Kohler had experiments with chimpanzees where they would do is they would have a bunch of boxes around the room and a bundle of bananas dangling from the ceiling, slightly out of reach. And a lot of times the chimps would jump, they would reach, they would try to get the bananas, but then they would kind of sit, and they would look around, and they would seem like they were kind of despondent, kind of didn't know what to do. And then, boom, they pick up the boxes, they stack them together, climb on them, and get their bananas. So this is an example of insight-based learning. Again, learning isn't always a perfectly linear trajectory. Sometimes we don't necessarily show the benefits of learning until we kind of hit this critical mass. If you've ever had that big aha moment where things make sense, our brains are processing that information and trying to solve problems and trying to learn all the time, even if we're not really consciously thinking about it. And those aha moments, eureka moments, are a result of the insight learning capabilities that we all have, including upper level primates. Pretty slick. Now, we talked about conditioned and now biological influences on learning. Again, we're kind of rounding out the lecture here. It's been about an hour and a half. That's a good time for me. So conditioned taste aversion, like I said, we talked about, I think Raina had brought up earlier that, like, what happens when you get sick after you eat something? Odds are it can have a very lasting effect, and people tend to be very good at determining what it is in the meal that made them sick. And so even after long delays, and even in as little as one trial, people can develop very strong conditioned taste aversions, something like fish, spoiled produce, milk, eggs, anything that they believe made them sick. Now, what this also points to is that there is some evidence that we do not necessarily existing in a world. Our brains are not equipotent. We are more prepared to condition to certain things than others. There are certain things, like, for example, in the wild world of, my previous example of social media and conditioning by retweets and my phone vibrating. That's not something that people are necessarily prepared to do. It's just not. It's not a natural thing versus like food and taste aversions, which we are very prepared to develop associations around. So what we would say then is that we have a preparedness, or some would say an evolutionary preparedness for fears towards certain things. People can develop fears of snakes and spiders very readily. And much more readily than they can around things like cars and guns. Now, this might be an illusory correlation, and it might be more likely that the certain stimuli are more likely to elicit negative consequences, but a rare tip of the hat to evolutionary psychology in this series, I think it makes sense that there is a level of evolutionary predisposition that we might have to develop certain responses around certain things. You might remember that it was a trend even a while back that cats freak out when they're exposed to cucumbers because in their brains, they are prepared to respond to the long, thin object as if it were a snake. And so cats freak the fuck out when they see cucumbers because it to them is a snake, and they're very prepared to develop a phobia or a fear reaction to things that remind them of or they believe to be snakes because they're dangerous. Which speaks to some kind of instinct. And so we talk about instinctual drift, which is that over time, we and other animals tend to have a tendency to return to innate behaviors. This is gonna be a good one. As my favorite video, maybe ever, that I will ever show you. And I love many of the videos that I've shown you in this video, or in this series. You want to see a raccoon get sad? So raccoons have a innate, I know, right? They have an innate disposition. They wash the food that they get. I'm sorry. It's for science. Bear with me. Raccoons wash the food that they get. So what happens when you give the raccoon a piece of cotton candy? It's okay. They still get sugar water. They get sweet water. Oh, they got the candy in the end. So what's interesting about this is that, you know, over time and over repeated efforts. See, this is the happy ending I didn't tell you guys about. Learning still occurs. The raccoon. Let's go back and watch the raccoon get some candy again. Oh, the raccoon gets the candy. Now you can also tell what I've been watching lately. You get raccoon videos and action button reviews. The 6-hour Tokimeki more, and also videos of deer getting mad at people. This is my existence on YouTube. So. So that's what we take away from that. It's like, so what do we take away from the raccoon? Over time, the raccoon will figure it out again. But over time, like, they do drift back to washing the food. It's an instinctual drift. And they learn over time, like, oh wait, shit, don't wash this thing because it's not going to end well. But over time, they're going to drift back to it because it's just kind of ingrained. It's a prepared behavior that they do. Now, oh, I forgot to show this one too. This one's also kind of cute. I had one more link for you. Let's see. So turns out crows are jerks. So it turns out that crows, even crows that are raised by people, have an instinctual desire to pull on other animals' tails. Like, it just happens. Even when they're raised by humans, they are not raised by other crows. There's no real explanation in terms of conditioning for why they do it. But they do it, and it's funny. Boink. And then they fly away. Yeah, that's it. It's big. So one ornithologists, or people that study birds, believe that this might be because in the wild, what crows will do is they will yank another animal's tail so that a predator might then get startled and run away, or they might try to chase the bird. And let's say they're in pairs. So the other, like, the one predator the main predator trying to, like, so they're arguing over a carcass or something, chases crow A, crow B sneaks in and steals their food. Because crows are assholes and frighteningly intelligent birds. But it's something they do. It's an instinct. They'll do it even if they've had no contact with other birds. They were raised by people. It's just a thing they do. It's a weird thing. They just do it all the time. It's really funny. Corvids rule. They rule so hard. If I didn't already have a dog familiar, I would probably have a corvid, but that's what re-debuts are for, right? So let's bash some learning fads here. All right, learning fads. Sleep-assisted learning. No. We talked about sleep last time. If you're just tuning in for the first time, go peep my YouTube link. I have a set of lectures that I've done so far. Go to the one on consciousness. We talked about sleep. So sleep-assisted learning is the idea that you can, like, let's say you have a book on tape and you fall asleep listening to it and you're going to learn while you're sleeping. Doesn't work. You're not processing the information. So if it may work, it might work. Big caveat, may work if it wakes you up, which defeats the point of it being sleep-assisted learning, because you're only really learning if you're processing the information. You're not processing the information if you're not asleep. If you're asleep, so you have to be awake. So the noise wakes you up, and that's the only reason it works. It doesn't work that way. Accelerated learning. Gifted education. It goes by a lot of different names. Learning, like this one, very hard to say because there aren't good control groups. Typically, like the kids that test into accelerated learning are put into accelerated learning. They aren't put in, like, kept in their normal classrooms and then seeing how they develop over time. So it's one of those interesting bits. So, you know, it's hard to say gifted education courses, do they matter? Do people learn more effectively? Yeah, it's hard to tell. Discovery-based learning versus direct instruction. This is the paradigm of like what we consider like, I guess, like normal school or traditional schooling versus like Montessori learning. It might depend more on the learning goal. So this is the kind of thing, there might be different things. So where a certain things and certain skills might be actually better for Montessori style learning, or where kids get to kind of choose what they want to work on. They get to kind of discover things as they go, versus a directed learning curriculum. Probably depends. You know, I know as a kid, I hated math. I probably would have never attended a math lecture of my own volition. So outside of directed instruction, I probably would have never learned how to do long division, and then forgotten how to do long division, and then embarrassed myself in front of however many people are watching me on Twitch when I decided to do long division on that one time on stream and got the wrong answer. Remember, I'm a doctor, just not of math. Here's a good one too. Learning styles. You've probably heard a couple variations of this. Some people are more auditory learners. Some people are more visual learners. Some people do better on online courses. Some people do in-person courses. It honestly, the research seems to suggest that it doesn't really matter. And it probably comes down more to the quality of the teaching, more so than the style of the learner. Now, some people and some instructors are going to be better at teaching online versus teaching in person. And that is probably where it comes in. It's less about a learning style. It's more about, is the teacher good at teaching in that environment? So that's my my 2 cents on that one. Because like I've had online courses that were great. I've had online courses where I learned nothing. And I think it really comes down more to how the comfort of the instructor, more so than me being a online or offline learner. So that's my 2 cents on that one. Yeah. So like I'm gonna go ahead and, having not known your instructor and just like knowing people. Yeah. Remember, just tell your professors that the VTuber deer said that they probably suck. Look, I've been a professor. I've done the things. I know that most academics are bad teachers. Like, it was very telling that in my first semester of teaching, my overall evaluations put me in the upper crust of the department, including faculty members. And I was a first-time teacher as a grad student. Yeah, would you believe that Google has a book on learning? I would believe that Google has a book on learning. I would also believe that this lecture is over. So I am going to, let's see, I'm going to wrap up here. I would like to take 1 second here to thank Aaron for the raid, the huge raid. Thank you so much, Aaron. I hope your extra live stream went well. I hope everything worked out. And let's see, let's take a peep ahead at what we're going to be looking at next. Let's see. I think Aaron was playing Mahjong. I super hope that went well. I do love me some Mahjong. Funny thing is, I have a Discord, and people can just send me questions there. Yeah, I just or just afterwards. I always set time aside afterwards. Like, actually, it's the main reason that I have my Discord initially was to like talk about stuff and like take questions and everything. And now it's mostly just a spot. Oh, that's awesome! That's awesome! That's awesome! That's awesome! That's awesome! I love to hear when charities go well. Yeah, that rules. So we're gonna be talking about memory next week. Was Minimat was on that one too, right? I saw him tweeting about it. So that's a little thing. All right. Looking ahead, we are doing memory next time around. Weather Witch asks questions to Psychology Witch. Let's do it. It sounds like fun. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't like it. So let's see, what do we got here? Got some fun. Oh, this is gonna be fun. So we're gonna be talking about what are we getting into next time. We're talking about long-term memory, we're talking about short-term memory, we're talking about recency effects, we're talking about encoding, we're talking about amnesia, we're talking about eyewitness testimony, we're talking about a lot of fun stuff. Oh, I guess thank you, Matt, too. Yeah, I was surprised that Aaron rated me. Yeah, everyone thinks your short-term memory is all right until 20 seconds pass. Yeah, it should be a fun one. All right. So for those of you that are here for the first time, I set aside about 30 minutes after lecturing to just kind of chill and hang out, and also importantly to answer questions. So anyone that, like, if you have any burning questions about what we talked about here, or even if you, I'll get to that one after I get back here. I need at least a drink in hand to do that. We're gonna, if you want to even like ask about the lecture, you want to ask about whatever. Usually I pour myself an adult beverage. I got a Pilsner upstairs. I'm gonna crack open and just chill for a bit and just round out my week before I go back into the hellhole of selling my labor for capitalism. Yeah, should be fun. So yeah, if you want to stick around, cool. If not, it's been a lot of fun. So thank you for stopping by. And I am gonna go to my my what kind of Pilsner? Shit, let me bring this up. Let's see, because yeah, I went to I just moved, so I went to a new brewery and grabbed their I just went in and said, like, I want a Pilsner, and they had two, and I grabbed yes on website. I am over 21. I promise. Here's your tap room menu. Okay, it's a dry hopped Pilsner specifically. So the it is a, let's see, a lagerized, cold tolerant, Pentagonian yeast home to hybridized Usian. Oh God, I basically it's a classic Pilsner. It's dry hopped. It's pretty good. It's nice and crisp. It's what I wanted for autumn. All right, I'm gonna go pour myself one of those. I'm gonna go refresh my water. And like I said, it's been great having you all here. If you want to stick around, cool. If not, I'm just gonna throw on some chill beats, hang out for a bit, and it's so good. And we might end up just talking about beer. Ask me about lectures. Ask me about what have you. I'm an open book. I like to make myself available for stuff like this. So let's see. What's good for Dova syndrome? What am I feeling in the wild world of Dova syndrome? Yeah, this one's really good. Hell yeah. All right, I'll see y'all in a bit.